Good evening, YouTube world and Facebook world. Welcome to the Joko Collective, Joko Conversation tonight. I am Brother Youssef, member of the Joko Collective, a poet and a professor here in the Los Angeles area, specifically at Santa Monica College, where I teach in the English department, composition courses and literature courses. And I am joined by my comrade and partner, Tasha.
Greetings and salutations, everyone, and all of our 14 viewers, our 14 regular viewers. Thank
Mhm.
you guys for keeping up with us and, uh, putting in your thought energy with us consistently. That is great. That's like having some kind of intimate dinner party conversation. It's like, something a little bit bigger than that, something a little bit more intense than that, even, right? Um, So, what a pleasure. And we start as we always do in salutation to our ancestors and those in our direct lineage, our direct inherited lineage, and those ancestors of the group, right? The great ancestors that have seen us through, that are exemplars of humanity and its potentials, those ancestors that have also that are exemplars of human potential in the work of resisting the age of oppression, right? Um, that the era of dominance of the European in the guise of white supremacy and capitalist domination represents for us, everyone, all humanity. Um, and so we call on those ancestors too, and we always stop to recognize that any work that we do on behalf of African peoples, the liberation of African peoples, we do it the hospitality of the original peoples of this land, of this Turtle Island. Um, and that's what we do. Okay. We make that recognition. We acknowledge that hospitality. We keep the proper perspective and understand that the uh, vast part of our um, presence in this Turtle Island has to do with our um, right? Are arriving as living commodities owned by um, European settler colonialists that came to make their fortune. Um, and so we remain ever mindful of that history and our disposition to it. And so tonight we are continuing with our discussion about the right's pushback against modernity. And with that, I will hand it over to Brother Yusuf to continue with tonight's topic, secularism and rationality in the modern world. And we will chop it up from there.
Yeah, and I guess that really is kind of the rub, right? Um, one of those hallmarks of modernity, or at least coterminous with what we call modernity. This process and this condition, this historical epoch that begins, and again, scholars will argue about, when does modernity begin, and the date that I use in a lecture I give to my English 2 class at the beginning of the semester to frame, the what we're reading and the social, political, cultural, historical context from which it arises. Um, I use the 1450s as a starting point, or maybe the 1460s. I can't remember exactly, but the mid 15th century, um, po- looking at the Portuguese arrival in Central Africa, right? The Angola area, as a beginning point. Um, Before that, I used to use 1492, right, and
Mm,
Columbus's arrival.
mm,
Um, at this point, where the in Western Europe, right, the society is still primarily organized on feudal lines, right, with um, monarchies, and monarchies that are challengeable, right? That are being challenged by various, barons and counts and other members of the aristocracy. Um, but this is at a time when that's going to shift, and those monarchs are going to be able to gather um, power around them, sort of begin re-centralizing that power, and in some way taming their aristocratic rivals. The And I think a lot of that has to do with also uh, the new wealth that's coming into the realm, right, under the auspices of the monarch, right, Prince Henry the Navigator, right, and the new products and human chattel coming into the Iberian Peninsula. Um, and then certainly when the Americas, right, are discovered and invaded, and the riches, right, that come back and are filling the coffers in Spain and Portugal. Um, the moment around the time when the Pope, and I can't remember which Pope. I think it was a Pope Urban, but I'm not positive which one. Um, signs that papal bull, and the I can't the line of demarcation, right, that divides the
mhm,
world
mhm,
between Spain and Portugal, the Catholic, monarchies. And so that that's a good beginning point, right? And um, this incursion into Africa, into traditional Africa, and into the Americas some decades later, following an experience of the Crusades in Western Europe, right? The destabilizing character in Africa as it's going to unfold, in the Americas as it's going to unfold, um, and in Europe, right? As new forces are beginning to rise, and these new relations and these new discoveries, right, begin to further enrich and make central new emerging classes, and again, the falling away, in some cases the withering away, of the traditional social relations, traditional relationships to the land, traditional obligations, right, of the social contract. As that stuff begins to wither and the feudal system begins to wither away, and this mercantilist capitalism is beginning to emerge, 16th century, right, maybe even some folks could probably point to early 15th century, but that really takes off, right, in the 15th century, with the landfall of the Americas and the increasing wealth of the human trafficking in Africans. That over the next centuries is going to just fill incredible coffers, right, and create these appetites for the new products like tea, or products that had been just for the most elite: tea, coffee, sugar, the mass production of these, the creation of these, commodities and markets for the et cetera, right? All of this. And with that, happening with it, right? The age of reason and the emergence of the Enlightenment, and this and the challenge to the traditional religious authority, the Catholic Church. So the Protestant Reformation, right, is an important aspect of modernity, right, and in some sense, the democratizing of religion. Um, you know what what's going to lead to democratizing, or at least a a generalizing of literacy, with Gutenberg's movable press. And even though books continue to be expensive, right, they're still more widespread, right, and the opportunity for more literacy, and again, that continues to kind of grow. Don't want to overstate, the early years of, overstate literacy, but I think, you get the point, right? These things. So now people are able to, read the Bible, read it in their own language, right? Because now it's being printed in the local languages, and make their own interpretations. Um, yeah. So all of these, beginning to mark modernity, but also this move toward what is knowledge, right? Or even, is the world knowable? Yes, the world is knowable, right? And it's knowable through very specific types of methods that ends up privileging empiricism, the material world, right, as what's knowable, what can be demonstrated, and this development of the scientific method, as we've come to know it in the Western idea, right, of science, that is, of knowledge or knowledge making, right, through the scientific method. And as I'm talking about that, so I'm looking at the Odoo behind us, right, and the cornmeal, right, which represents another system of knowing, right, another system of knowledge that would likely be looked at, and I don't even know why I'm hedging. Not even likely, right? People would definitely think of as anti-scientific, right? That this is it's certain, it's not empiricist, which is what I think they really mean, right? Is what's the empirical evidence for whatever that this represents, or whatever kind of knowledge, can that be called knowledge? Um, and with that, right, with that eventual elevation by the 19th century, post Age of Reason, post Age of Enlightenment, and those are kind of the same thing, but not necessarily. Folks will look to the Age of Reason beginning in the 17th century, right, and then the Enlightenment, and 18th century, and really, I think, kind of heir to the Age of Reason, right? Because Descartes, right, is 17th century, right? Galileo was 17th century, and then you get the Voltaires and the Rousseau and the Jeffersons, right? The Enlightenment thinkers. But the challenge, to the religious way of knowing the world. So a move toward empiricism, secularism, um, the elevation of the rational, the rational in governance, right, a challenge to the divine right of kings, looking the idea of merit of, what is it, merit of accomplishment, I guess, merit of quality, character, rather than merit of blood, begins to end um, this moment of rupture with the past, this moment of rupture with traditional religious thinking, right? These things are able to emerge, and continue to, I think, animate, politics, right? The For some, right, the ultimate, or well, yeah, for some, I think the logical conclusion, maybe, or the logical direction, right, of a scientific and a rational view toward society and all, various aspects of society, including the economy, leads one to socialism, right? The rational planning of society. And for many, right, who would certainly consider themselves modernists, that's anathema, right? Because capitalism, despite all its irrationality and whatever is meant by, and I do not make any claims to know, even though I hear it all the time, what Adam Smith means by the hidden hand, right, of the market and all this. But which in and of itself is sort of an irrational kind of thought, right? The hidden hand. I mean, unless he is thinking of some very specific force, right? That which I've heard multiple interpretations of. And then the pushback against that, right? Um, it, this kind of conflict that animates, so much of what we see with this kind of pushback, the pushback against what emerges as, liberal politics, liberal again in the broadest sense of, you know, a, a generalized franchisement and citizenry that has a voice somehow in the government, and the government is somehow representative of the people. Whether it's a form of bourgeois democracy or social democracy, what constitutional democracy, as places have held on to these vestiges of the past. For some folks, what we think of as modernity ends with the end of World War II, and we move into post-modernity, or, well, into post-modernity, right? For others, postmodernism is really kind of a cultural, artistic, philosophical term, and what we are in post World War II is late modernity. Partly because the same features, are at play, including the same conflicts, and I think in a way, um, the forces of tradition that were waylaid by the mid 20th century have come roaring back. Um, in I wouldn't say they are ascendant as such, but they've come roaring back, right? And um, this, sort of the emergence of irrationality, um, and is that different? You've heard me use the term, I think, before, right? The idea of, the extra rational, as opposed to the irrational. I might say, that Odu, right, and the the work that went into knowing that this was the Odu for the Joko could be described as extra rational, not irrational. But there is a such thing as the irrational, and very much tied to religion. Also, at least seemingly making a comeback of sorts. I mean, it depends. It sometimes depends on what echo chamber you're in. Um, so anyway, and that was just kind of a recap, right, of this, since it's in the title, right, and what's meant by modernity. And I'm still not always sure that was the correct term to use, right? Because maybe it's liberalism, or the various progressive aspects of the 20th century, in particular the 19th and the 20th century, that are being pushed back against, and not modernity as such. So that's, yeah, just a thought anyway.
up for grabs
Yeah.
in a sense.
Yes.
Well, I really like the way you how you talk about that periodization of modernity and as a fluid border, if you will, right?
Mm-hmm.
As necessarily fluid, always kind of bringing into the mix a commentary about there being, this is the border of indecision around this issue. You know,
Mm-hmm.
people, folks are agreeing around this kind of 100-year zone, but the main points and the main parts and the definitions is still murky. And I think that that is important when we talk about rationality and its limits.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that it's a good um, relative to what we're talking about overall in terms of the political moment and the main actors in the political moment,
Yeah.
particularly the American political moment, right? Because they're talking in terms of a pushback toward to monarchy. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that in this whole
Mm-hmm.
field of relativism and relativism and conversation, I think that is really meaningful and really appropriate to use the phrase a pushback against modernity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, um, precisely because of that push toward feudalism, feudal power structure, a
Mm-hmm.
feudal power
Yeah.
structure, and folks that are identifying themselves as monarchists and, you know, wanting to uh, reestablish those relationships, which I have been hearing about really probably for how old am I? Really old. For like a couple of decades. I've
Couple of
been hearing
decades, though. Yes.
about this neo-feudal the stirrings of this neo-feudal uh, uh, push and politic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but, it's been about 20 years since I've, been hearing about folks commissioning uh, private armies of mercenaries, and
Yeah.
it was the talking about Blackwater and the this one
Mm-hmm.
and the that one and a little peep and then a hush and what is this about and you know and
Mm-hmm.
analysts talking about, well, part of what this is about is the wealthy being able to own private armies, which is
Private
nothing
armies.
different than the aristocracy having a company of knights and
Exactly.
it's
Exactly.
different,
That's part of that is feudal in character.
feudal in character, and so the other thing that I think is uh, good and also revealing about this nature of rationality is uh, the not only talking about kind of the murky borders, but also yes, addressing the murkiness of definition, right? Even when we're talking about rationality, which is supposed to have this solid character, is supposed to have this or the material world is supposed to have this solid quality,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that solidity means, this concept
Mm-hmm.
of a real, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to the imaginary and the notion that the imaginary or the non-real not having force, not having power, not having
Yeah.
viability, right? And there's a million and one ways to talk about that, to kind of disprove that on its face, just in terms of human thinking without having to ask about things like uh because there's always kind of a projection and a switch to this notion of, well, if you're not talking about empirical realism, then you're talking
Mm-hmm.
about something called witchcraft
Mm-hmm.
or magical.
Magical. Yeah.
And I want to say thinking because that
Yeah.
actually
I don't. I
belongs
don't
in the
either.
other discussion of
Yeah.
rationality and irrationality.
Mm-hmm.
So going into this area of, like, with the reference to the Odu, with the reference to African thought, which uh, for not too long ago, it hasn't been so long that phrase in itself would hit the ear as an oxymoron, right? And for
Mhm.
many people, it certainly does, right? But then for a whole lot of us who have been exposed to the narratives that expose the inner logics of African symbolism, of culture, of getting exposed to the number of languages and written languages and written symbol systems, you know what I'm saying, has to do with all of this reclamation of ancient Egypt as a Black culture, you know. And of course, we're always in this area where Blackness has been defined in terms of whiteness. So you can't, you know, you can't have it both ways. You know, you can't have it both ways. You can't have black skinned Caucasians. You know, you don't get to do that
However
for
much you want to call people that, to
unless you, yeah,
put them on your team. Teams you
exactly.
created. And just
Exactly. But which is my point, right? But that's is becomes that becomes a contradiction in terms, right?
yeah.
So in terms of this rationality and this African thought, I think that what is proved, or let me talk about what I've learned about African thinking and African thought in practice and in the very superficial study that I've done, right? And exposure, right? One of these, and that's something that I think makes it superior. Um, I don't want to use the term superior, more expansive in its capacity than the dualism, right? That Cartesian dualism and that what do they refer to it as classical physics and all of these kinds of making the real attempts is that it's, as you have used the term, multivalent, right? Where things can happen more than one thing can actually happen simultaneously, can be true at the same time. Things that are have an apparent superficial contradiction can exist at the same time. And when
Mhm.
you talk about what the European, and I'm going to arrest it here, stop it here, um, in reflections on what he observes and studies and what have you of African culture and cultural systems and what have you. His thinking and definitions defining of the world, and right, it's named polytheistic, with monotheistic characters, animistic, having all right references to nature and the viability of nature and all these kinds of things. When if we're thinking about it in terms of thought, we're thinking about of something that has the capacity to refer to make a transcendent reference to qualities, something transcendent like quality, and at the same time refer to material categories, act as a categorizing paradigm, as a taxonomy, right? So it's a sorting, it's also a way of sorting, of associating, right? And categorizing things in the material manifest world. Yeah. So that, that being said, there is, for the person who is able to break down many centuries of institutionalized demonization of of spiritual systems that have this characteristic, right? Um, and get into some experiential piece with it, there is an understanding. We there's a potential of living that understanding, and an understanding that is very helpful, actually, in terms of conflict resolution. It's very helpful if you can have, if two things can be true at the same time, if there can be a reach outside of the apparent conflict to, right, it has some implications for those kinds of potentials. It has the implications to be able to consider, right, uh the interests, holistic interests, right? How we can consider at the same time the needs of the animal world and the insect world and the quality of the air and the quality of the soil and the needs of the human and all these kinds of things. Yeah. um and of course, often that is subsumed in the area of divination, right? Um, a method of knowing beyond apparent contradictions, and also a method of knowing that says, in my human mental habit, right, there is an impasse, and I have to go beyond that into an area of symbolism, etc., to gain some deeper understanding. So that's like an interesting kind of point of departure. That's kind of on the other side, even of our main conversation, rational and irrational, and irrationalism, right, which are um, um, at odds, right? And irrationalism is not a good for humans, and is not a something that is, as you have already asserted, not something that is synonymous with something that is super rational, right, or beyond rationality. Yeah, that's another quality. Yeah, of African practices, right? That there
Yeah.
is profound appreciation for the rational and a
Mhm.
rejection of the irrational. There is, right, the capacity and ability
And
to
many other ways of knowing around the world, right? That,
absolutely,
you know, can live with the contradictions and the inconsistencies, the apparent
yes,
inconsistencies, and
yes,
etc. Right? It's not,
yes,
and even within, right, um, the traditional societies of Europe, uh, both pre-Christian and within the Christian tradition also.
mm-hmm,
And we are primarily talking about Western Europe, but
mm-hmm,
these
mm-hmm,
things extend into Eastern Europe also.
mm-hmm,
Various Southern Europe, right?
mm-hmm,
The Because even within, at the beginnings of these
mm-hmm,
processes, right?
mm-hmm,
The church, certainly the church in the West, and I believe also could say in the East, were the very custodians of the scientific tradition, right? And
mm-hmm,
both Kepler and Copernicus were priests, Catholic priests. And the Vatican still maintains, right, a Vatican astronomer, right, physicist. I mean, why do we wear the graduation gowns we wear, right, whether faculty or graduates? Because we're dressing like medieval clerics, right? These were the custodians of
mm-hmm,
knowledge, and a lot of what we think we know about what's called the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages is maybe a product of Hollywood and you know novels. The
mm-hmm,
Dark Ages weren't quite as dark
mm-hmm,
as people tend to think,
mm-hmm,
um, and certainly not in the ways people may mean.
mm-hmm,
And who's naming it this?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Enlightenment scholars, right? Who are looking,
mm-hmm,
we who now live in the light, right, can look back and judge these people in a certain way. Um, so, but nonetheless, right, this moment we're living in, there is a palpable and even a palpable hostility to secularism, to many of the advances and I think they should be called advances
mm-hmm,
that have been
mm-hmm,
made in the various
mm-hmm,
applications of
mm-hmm,
science, of what's called modern Western science,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
um, that's being rejected,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
often on religious grounds, or
mm-hmm,
religious grounds are being used to manipulate populations,
mm-hmm,
whether that's around reproductive health,
mm-hmm,
um, whether that is around, climate science,
Mhm.
whether that
Mhm.
is around and the anatomy of sex,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, whether or not people should take medicine
Mhm.
or not, right?
Mhm.
And which
Mhm.
medicines should they
Mhm.
take? And
Mhm.
um, and very much so in this last, like, 30 years. I mean, I think there's always been a contingent, right, of
Mhm.
folks, right, who are resistant um,
Mhm.
to various medicines,
Mhm.
technologies, etc.
Mhm.
But it's become a lot more generalized, it seems, in this
Mhm.
certainly this last 30 years, maybe 40
Absolutely.
years, right?
Yes. Can we hold there
Mhm.
and come back to it? And I want to ask you if you will venture a definition of secular.
Well, it's society and culture that is organized, that is I'm trying not to use the negative, right, that is not
Mhm.
organized around um, a, a, a religion or religious thinking, set of rules, religious set of rules, um, that right, that the religious it becomes uh, not
Mhm.
the organizing principle of the society, um,
Mhm.
of the public world, right? Of
Mhm.
the public,
Mhm.
not um, you know, not the private sphere.
Mhm. Mhm.
Rome could not be called a secular society, right? Every senator was also a priest, and um, one of my favorite contemporary historians whose lectures I like to listen to, John Hamer,
Mhm.
who is a pastor, right, in Community of Christ Church in Toronto. Though he's from the United States originally and grew up in the Mormon tradition, or what we would call, that is, the Latter-day Saints tradition, and because he talks about the differences, right? He's in Community of Christ. They are not the Latter-day Saints of Utah, etc. They got,
Okay.
uh, he he makes the point, right, that when you see the traditional Roman toga, when the toga is worn as we ordinarily expect it to be worn, that person is working in the secular sphere, and when the senator puts pulls it up and covers his head with it, then he becomes a priest, right? And
Mm.
um, the Roman state, the whole idea of making an offering to the genius of the emperor, all this sort of stuff, right? So it's a different, it's a, even though a republic, right, res publica means a public thing, which really means it doesn't belong to any king, right? But it didn't stop, the sort of the religious character of the state just moved from the monarchy to the ruling class, right? The patrician class, and maybe even plebeians had some religious role to play, but all that's gone, right? And the modern citizen, right? The modern state, the modern liberal state, right? We are citizens, and our festivals are civic. They are not religious, right? Um, Simply put, so secular, the desacralized state, right? The desacralized, de-religiousized society, which of
Mhm.
course, religions don't like. Right? And so, you
Mhm.
know, I think I can say with certainty, just generally speaking, right? The Catholic Church was certainly anti-liberal well into the late 19th century, though individual, I think Father Hidalgo of Mexico, right at the beginning of the Mexican War for Independence, couldn't be called um, anti-liberal, right? He's so certainly you have individuals,
Mm-hmm.
but
And you're using the term liberal how in that context?
in the broadest sense of of liberal government,
Mm-hmm.
where citizens have a vote, elect
Mm-hmm.
representatives, or some form of direct democracy. Um, whether contending parties,
Mm-hmm.
typically in the bourgeois state,
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, forms of direct democracy in some of the socialist states like Cuba, the people's committees, and there
Mm-hmm.
are various forms. But that right,
Mm-hmm.
that form of the state that is not
Mm-hmm.
the traditional monarchy, um, yeah, the traditional monarchical, state,
Mm-hmm.
or theocracy.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I know people like to say modern Iran is a theocracy.
Mm-hmm.
It calls itself the Islamic Republic,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe for some folks that's a contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
It's got a Republican form of government, a president. They
Mm-hmm.
have elections and stuff, and then
Mm-hmm.
then there's the Supreme Council or whatever. I mean, I don't
Mm-hmm.
understand. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
anyway.
Well, that it's interesting just saying that much, right? References complexity
Mm-hmm.
and the capacity to manage complexity, um, intellectually and emotionally, which is I would imagine a challenge of an age where there is increased confrontation with complexity and difference, cultural complexity and difference,
Mm-hmm.
um, cultural change of various kinds, whether that's technological change, right,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's change in culture as a effect of a lot of different people from a lot of different parts of the globe converging in particular areas because of economic forces. What are
Mm-hmm.
the push and pull factors of
Mm-hmm.
migration? All of
Mm-hmm.
that, right? And so there is this conflict with the world reality, with material reality,
That's right.
and belief structures. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to say something about belief and something about that after I say this, and belief structures that may not be able to explain difference, diversity, movement,
Mm-hmm.
complexity, nuance, all of those
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the only emotional responses available are anxiety, which is a sibling of depression, a sibling of anger, a sibling of fear, right? Those are
Mm-hmm.
the things. Yeah. Rarely is it, oh, I'm feeling anxious. Let me transcend this anxiety and look over the horizon. No, it's
Yeah,
like, let me
that
get
has
my
to be
pitchfork,
learned.
my stick, huh?
Mm-hmm. That has
Right?
to be learned, right?
That has to be learned, right? Learned. So
Mm-hmm.
this whole question, right? You talked about about movable type being one of the demarcations of the modern age, of the expanding of the modern age, and like this expansion, even though it is not among the great many, right, of people coexisting in a state. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
um it is still right, the expansion of
It's
literacy
significant still.
and
Yeah.
participation in the thinking about the world in a
Yes.
context that says, there is an I as an individual that has and I don't want to overuse the word, has a place. Let me just say a place
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in thinking and relating to these literatures that are right. So jump forward to right the um, uh, age of demand, the time of demand for public education. Yeah. Here, there's all of this information is being accumulated, and all of and all the masses of people are non-literate and not exposed to these things that we as a
Mm-hmm.
class
Mm-hmm.
are right. and that we're now living in terms of, this
Mm-hmm.
is not appropriate. There must be an education opportunity, right? Which expands, yeah, uh, uh, the quest and the assertion and the assumption of literacy, right? And tapping into some of these ideas expands a sense of place in the power structure, place in the world, a sense of not being at the whim of, which is something that we as African descendant people in this US and around anywhere in the world, I totally misspoke, anywhere in the world, post chattel slavery, post colonialism, we know what it is to feel that we have no place in the world, that our life is appropriately at the whim. And some of us now will tell you, thank God for,
Mm-hmm.
we are so grateful that we were Christianized, because we would have been, right, which is the right part of this narrative,
Mm-hmm.
right? The
That is
sibling,
one of the great paradoxes of modernity, as
right.
indeed, right, the life expectations of the vast majority of those who describe themselves as white
Yes.
improved. The life expectations, opportunities of those described as non-white get crushed to the ground, right? I mean,
Yes.
the it is
Yes.
not the development of the one has has been conducted in such a way that it required the underdevelopment, de-development,
Yes.
erasure
Yes.
of everyone else, right? Um,
Yes.
the the regression of everyone else, the freezing of folks in time, so to speak, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we become sort of junior participants in Western modernity.
Mm-hmm.
That's always been my, well, uh, this is superficial at best, but that's the thing that is one of the things that bothers me about Paul Gilroy's um, construction of the Black Atlantic, right? And because he constructs it, in the title of the work or the subtitle of the work, a counter modernity, right? The counter modernity of Black people. But I'm like, it puts us always in the position of having to be the second term, always in response, reaction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
because it's, anyway,
Mm-hmm.
it's, I'm like, it's the same modernity,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and
Mm-hmm.
it has required us, it has required, the global South, the non-white world, um, everywhere to devolve socially,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
economically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Couldn't
Mm-hmm.
do that culturally, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Though certainly some cultural distortion, right? And anyway, that yeah, that that what's called the dark underside of modernity, right? It is built on the bones and the souls of the vast majority, the four-fifths of humanity, right? So,
Absolutely, under the illusion, right, which is part of, right, this extended, so you have this, right, class of the literate, class of, like, these evolving schools of thought, that, the people who can participate in literacy, and the going stories, right, the going prominent stories and narratives, right, are consumed by these narratives, absorbed by these narratives, which are limited in their nature, which are biased in all these sorts of ways. Nonetheless, you know, this dynamic class of people, yeah, uh, are I think can also be described as schools of thought, yeah, that are having enormous impacts, right? Again,
Mhm.
in the context, right? A liberal context where there's enfranchisement and power sharing and the, whether it's the concept of manufacturing consent in in one sense, or just the effects of these narratives, because right, you have the need to create the savage of your white supremacist imagination,
Mhm.
and the it as right the
Mhm.
um racial categorizations, the racial technology emerges as sibling with the age of reason. So the European begins to
Uh-huh.
think of himself as a rational animal, literally, actually, of a rational being. At the same time, he begins to, um, and I'm deliberately using the he, though the she is involved in this, but I'm deliberately using the he because there's a narrative of the irrationality of females, of women, right? But thinking of himself as a rational being at the expense of all others' rationality. So, right, um, the capacity for the sacred rationality or for the esteemed rationality is the privilege and the uh, hmm soul possession, right, of this landed uh, and wealthy and propertied white male. Because the other piece of this is the concept of the concept of white trash. Nancy Eisenberg, 500, what is it, 400 years of class. I wish I'm not calling the title of her book properly, and that's terrible. But the name of the book is White Trash: 500 Years or 400 Years of kind of the invisibilizing class of class.
Yeah, yeah, something like I know what you're talking
You know what I'm
about.
talking
Yeah.
about. And someone out
Mhm.
there knows what I'm
Yes.
talking about, right? Because what she talks about is the notion in Anglo-Saxon culture, and she limits it there, but she doesn't say that it's not existing in other areas, but of a permanent uh underclass, a permanent of
Mhm.
people, right, that are the mud sills that are supposed to be the fodder upon which the other classes build themselves, right? And this is the notion of white trash, right? So even as the right these the other whites have these expectations to participate in the great whiteness that has now been pronounced, right?
Right.
They actually have this other role to play that they're resisting. It's like, no, 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 but we are part of the whiteness. Where is our privilege? Where is our birthright? And this, and so, yeah, this real, it must be a very profound confusion and resentment to see unwhite peoples have
Mhm.
social mobility that they're
Right.
not enjoying. This seems must be some kind of literally a natural contradiction. This cannot be, but I am white. So
Right.
anyway, all of that
Right.
being all of that being said, this looking at this rationality as a product of or an expectation, a cultural expectation, part of the cultural currency of the self-identified modern person, yeah, even at odds with, thank you, yes, thank you, even at odds even with the reality or the absorption of these ideas on a very broad level, right? So there's this gap between, say, what is thought should be common knowledge for literate persons or cosmopolitan persons or what have you, yeah, very class defined, and what has actually been absorbed in terms of, right? So there's this void, there's this in terms of scientific thinking and understandings and trends in scientific thinking, right? Who are the people who are opening the magazines, the books, the journals, of which there are increasingly few, right? But over a period of the past 50 years, say 60 years, right? Those literate persons who are keeping up with the discoveries and the new ways of thinking of this and the that and the other, and then vast portions of the population who are not involved in that conversation. So you have this void, this gap, right? Um, where you can very where that explains well how we end up in a place where there are flat earthers, where there are folks who are not understanding the relationship between vaccination and public health, where folk, you know what I'm saying, where there are
I
these
do, and
gateways.
I think that it is. Yeah, there, certainly there are fewer journals, but there wouldn't have been a bunch of people reading them anyway, right? That is information that folks would be getting in school,
Mm-hmm.
the funding, and maybe something like PBS, right?
Mm-hmm.
Shows like what, Bill
Mm-hmm.
Nye the Science Guy, etc. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, a robust, I'm not sure what to call it, science desk at newspapers. But this is also the period, right? This very period. And really, I'm thinking now, really like the last 50 years, but especially the last 40 plus years of, the quite purposeful defunding of education, right?
Mm-hmm.
Making, but yeah, just that defunding of education, right? Or keeping even the best, a defunding of public education, was the education in the private schools, especially the more shishi private schools, perfectly fine, right? But
Mm-hmm.
the defunding of public education, K through university level, really, but especially that K through 12, it has been part of the and I think probably the critical part of the loss of scientific literacy.
Mm-hmm.
And while that is going on, while there are active efforts to defund education, to defund those programs, those subject areas that will encourage critical thinking, um, that will, defund those areas of the humanities, the arts, the social sciences, that will can encourage nuanced thinking, the
Mm-hmm.
ability to see, multiple factors at play,
Mm-hmm.
the dynamism in society,
Mm-hmm.
to understand why we're here through an accurate retelling of history. And but of course, this is this attack on education, and we are talking about the United States, right? Can't say that this is a problem globally,
Mm-hmm.
but it's the United States, and it's the friend of mine from back in undergraduate days who went and did. She went and did solidarity work in Nicaragua during the 80s, right? When the revolutionary Sandinista government was in. And they did some protesting, right? She
Mm-hmm.
with the other group of U.S. citizens who were, down there doing a work brigade work, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were protesting at the U.S. Embassy, and somebody from the embassy came out and talked to them and said, look, basically, when the U.S. sneezes, everybody gets the flu, something to that effect, right? We go. So anyway, this very specific um, effort to defund the schools, defund those parts of the schools that are
Mhm.
going to encourage critical thinking,
Mhm.
defund those parts of the sciences
Yep.
that do not lead into
Yep.
STEM, right?
Yep.
And particularly the technology, engineering, mathematics parts of STEMs, right? Uh,
Mhm.
the and then you have at the same time, right? The religious right,
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
challenging
Mhm. Mhm.
theories of evolution, um, the Big Bang theory, right? And what any of the discoveries of science. Um, because we know, the U.S.'s funky history, right? Um, you know, and I and now let me not just isolate the U.S., right? The empires of the West and the settler colonies around the world. We
Mhm.
know from the very beginning they weaponized medicine, right? They weaponized illness, and so there is, there's an understandable skepticism
Mhm.
among the various colonized communities of the world over the efficacy of certain things that folks are coming to bring. But I think we've also had enough time to see whether or not um, measles vaccines are worthwhile, et cetera. And
Mhm.
I've been thinking lately of this change. Used to hear, right, in the 70s, in the 80s, into the 90s, used to hear it's horrible. All these poor children, all dying all over the world from preventable diseases.
Right.
Well, what prevented those diseases are the vaccines.
Mhm.
But now
Mhm.
it's the vaccines that are making people sick, right? It's the vac
Mhm.
it was the shots that somebody gave, in Central Africa that started AIDS. This
Mhm.
sort. And I'm gonna say right here, the reading I've done, the stuff no, nobody has convinced me. No one has shown proof of this, right?
Mhm.
Um, it is just conjecture, but it's conjecture people want to believe, and they can put together some
Mhm.
convincing videos and
Mhm. Mhm.
arguments using some medical language that
Mhm.
the general public is not, isn't studying medicine and can't
And
be sure of what is and what isn't true.
yeah.
Um, go ahead.
So yeah, the in terms of what's needed for a common knowledge that allows judgment with discernment without the necessity of specialization, right? Because there is something there that allows that judgment, and part of that is understanding when something hasn't been proven, understanding when a correlation has been presented or a co-occurrence has been shown that doesn't necessarily mean a causal link. That
Mhm.
whole what
Correlation is not
trip
causation.
is not causation, that axiom, right,
Mhm.
of what statistical thinking of a kind of a branch of logical thinking. So there's a way, a mode of approach to information and information processing and understanding what kind. There's an exercise that I used to do, I remember doing in school, that asked the student to identify what information was needed to answer a certain question,
Mhm.
you know so far beyond is it right or wrong, but really this exercise in rationality, you know
Exactly.
right. So there is this, the problem of the fuzzy edges. Yeah, without those kinds of exercises, without that kind of these kind of fundamental understandings of logic and fallacy, and along with, sibling with, some contextual information, comes some contextualizing historical information. Yeah. We have these arguments that you like to talk about a lot, where you have the, well, science is just about a belief system, just like religion is a belief system, right? And they're able to say that because, well, they say all the time, they don't know, they don't really know. And this mistaking of uh what is it, a scientific discipline, a discipline, rhetorical discipline, right? A reserve, of reserve of conclusion,
You're frozen.
that recognizes that there may
Okay.
always be some information to disprove, to render, that there's always fallibility, you know,
Right.
um, and that the nature of accumulating reliable information is time tested, as you said. Over time, it can be observed that, and there is a way, right? All of these kinds of measures against a, well, I believe it because I believe it. And so there's, again, the fuzzy boundaries that are a part of knowledge. Yeah, it's all about these fuzzy boundaries and a limit of knowing, a limit of knowing.
And people are people are uncomfortable with the limits, right? Or
Yeah,
with the limits of their knowledge, with the fuzzy edges, right? That they want something definitive. And again, people um, don't understand just what you're talking about, right?
yeah,
It's not that we don't know, really. It's this is what we know now.
this is what we know now. And it is
And
a
with
relatively,
more, and we're continuing, but this
yes,
is the practice of science, right? And we're
yes,
continuing to find out.
yes. And there's also a kind of a projection, because that's something that you've really brought into my awareness as a person raised in faith and raised in uh, um, faith-based education,
Hmm.
in a mode that was not in competition with material rationality. But that has been under projected. The narrative that is sold is that there's some kind of enduring,
Right.
irreconcilable
Exactly. Right.
fight,
Where
irreconcilable.
Galileo remained a devout Catholic, right?
And who
even
knows that?
under even under arrest in the Vatican, right?
Who knows that? You know what I'm saying? It's
Right.
not part of, it's not what is emphasized, not what
Only
is
people
told.
who maybe have watched the PBS documentary, on
Yeah, but here we
and that's a
go.
very small group of people, right?
Very
So
small group of people, because again, and this is, I guess, next week's discussion, right? In terms of this concept of dumbing down, the
yeah,
concept of shaming curiosity, the
yes,
concept of shaming uh, uh, intellectualism that is very much promoted and popularized
yes,
in American culture.
and
The
yes,
anti-intellectual
intellectual,
strain and
the
culture that may
expertise,
not be
right?
common among
Hmm.
European cultures, right?
Yeah, or anywhere else, right? I mean, I
Yeah,
can't think of any others. I mean, I can't think that's true in Canada.
certainly not an Islamic.
Not in Islamic
Yeah,
countries, exactly. I
yeah.
mean, it seems such a peculiarly U.S. thing, and I'm sure we can. I'm certainly there are
You can
examples in
you
other
can
places, but
always
it's so
find an example.
generalized here,
Yeah.
or at least it feels like a significant, what they call a critical mass of the
Mhm.
residents in the United States,
Mhm.
um, which is all you ever need, right? Is a critical mass, you
And
know.
a critical mass, it's all you ever need, right? And this ability to take up space, rent space in the popular imagination, which
Yeah.
the mechanisms of the mechanism of television. And I guess probably the first real venture into that was radio. And I say real venture into that because I imagine that the uh, pre tele literate world had more access to variety of representation, more access to an engagement in debate, more access to a creative process of thinking as compared to a passive entertainment with inner formation, not to be like, in the way we talk
I
and,
mean, I don't know. Yeah,
overstand and all of that, but that works,
I mean, there's the 19th century, the 19th century press, right? I mean, there's, that was mass media before electronic media. It was the press. Now, again, wouldn't want to overstate, how generalized literacy is. But then
Right.
there was also the habit of public reading, right? That would
Uh-huh.
be more common. Um,
Wow. Right.
and um, certainly, again, depending on where people are, right?
Yeah.
And how they're organizing, and when and where they were organizing, and what does that mean for a settler society like the United States, where a whole bunch
Yeah.
of the 19th century is the U.S. settling, the continent. What does that look like, for the various imperial soldiers, right, of
Mm.
France and England and the Netherlands, um, and indeed a time when many of the what become the stereotypes of the 20th century that are really just kind of frozen, right, for in visual media. They're getting their start in this 19th century, right? I'm pretty sure Sambo was a 19th century late 19th century book by um, a British officer in India, and Sambo is actually
Uh-huh.
supposed to be about
Indeed.
Indians,
Uh-huh.
that gets translated,
Right.
to Africans.
Right.
The so yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, but I also think it's hard to generalize just because
It's always hard to generalize.
of
Yeah.
what, or just how creative people were being, right? And um, but it's there. I mean, people are doing it, right? The research is there. Newspapers put out by unions, for example, primarily to be read by union,
Yeah.
workers. And again, this idea of much more public
Mhm.
reading,
Mhm.
and which is really kind of true throughout sort of the history of literacy. I think is more public reading, since most
Mhm.
people weren't literate, right? So somebody
Mhm.
would be reading, um, in public. I wonder about that too. I mean, that's a great question, right? Think about the tradition of the black press, for example,
Mhm.
and certainly in the 19th century, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and then
Mhm.
what's one of the first really kind of successful genres in radio broadcasting, religious broadcasting.
Mhm.
And then this is also true in the
Mhm.
19th century,
Mhm.
print
Mhm.
revolution, right?
Mhm.
The emergence of these religious pamphlets of various kinds, and
Mhm.
the popping up of various churches. What does it mean to the theosophy, movement in the
Right.
19th century and all that.
Right.
It's an interesting time, though, right? Because the other thing you said, and really certainly beginning again in the 15th century,
Mhm.
but modernity, this fetish
Mhm.
among white supremacists,
Mhm.
white nationalists,
Mhm.
white Christian nationalists,
Mhm.
white neo-pagan nationalists,
Mhm.
etc., for
Mhm.
some kind of pure Europe, right?
Mhm.
This sort of,
Mhm.
white only Europe.
Mhm.
One, it has never been, right? There's always
Mhm.
been a non-white presence in what we call Europe,
Mhm.
that peninsula of the Asian
Mhm.
continent.
Mhm.
And certainly in modernity, right? We. We know that when Cortez conquered Mexico or invaded Mexico, many among the Spaniards were Afro Spaniards, right? The descendants of these
Mhm,
enslaved folks who had
mhm,
been being brought
mhm,
from the Congo and
mhm,
Angola.
mhm,
And what happened to the people of the Canary Islands? But I'm getting off on a tangent. But the point being, um, Africans, Asians, the indigenous people of the Americas, everywhere Europeans have gone, beginning in the 15th century through to the present, really, but certainly through the 19th century and into the 20th century,
mhm,
people have become involved in colonized people, have been part of the story. You have
mhm,
never had a pure
mhm,
Europe,
mhm,
and modern Europe is not the sole invention of
mhm.
Europeans, right?
Yes, and that which is, right, a factor or an effect, right, that whitewashing effect that,
Hmm.
um, the the drive to create that world. So in those spaces, you have a very, uh, uh you have a literature of that gives folks a real sense of intellectual, validity. You know, you
Hmm.
have a literature from from academies. You have a literature of, you know what I'm saying, which is
Hmm.
not at all surprising to folks who look at the dynamics of white supremacy because, yeah, it's establishment oriented. This is something, right,
Hmm.
that as people are reaching for white nationalisms and Christian nationalisms and what have you, those things can seem very, very validating when such a heavy duty part of the renormalizing of white supremacy is filling in what? That void of information. Oh, this is just a popular idea that really doesn't have weight. Let's look and see what these people thought. You know, these people
Hmm.
are
Hmm.
were the intellectuals of their time, and this was the notion, and this was, so there's a big aha moment, a sense of hidden truths uncovered that now resubstantiate, see, give an intellectual currency to my white supremacist notions, right, and revalidate that. But that whole piece about, and close up those fuzzy boundaries, right? That we're uncomfortable with, right? Um, and create this sense of truth with a capital T, that which is true, not that which is witnessed, documented, changing, how much we can understand at once, how to apply that, all these kinds of things, which interestingly, well, I'm going to say yes and no, because then you have there's not an automatic relationship by any means, between a successful application of, right, the rational process and the scientific process that necessarily leads you to a rationalizing for a just and equitable society that serves all or whatnot. You may very much be, as the eugenicists, right, on a mission to figure out how to, um, rid rid the world of undesirables to its root.
Isn't that a fundamental of logic, right? If you begin with a faulty premise, you're going to end up with a faulty conclusion.
I think so, but one way or another.
Right.
But there is this passion. It's like the the myth of endless growth, the
Yeah.
myth of endless, some kind of trajectory of endless economic growth and
Yeah. And,
potential for accumulating wealth, the
and
endless,
an inexhaustible earth.
inexhaustible supply, right?
Yeah.
And all of
So
those,
that
here
was very
again,
much what's oh, I'm gonna Francis Piven, um, historian, right, who writes, I think the book is called the Conquest of Paradise, about
Mm,
Columbus's invasion of the Americas. And he says at that time, Europe, or at least Western Europe, had more or less deforested itself, right? They were out of resources for the most part,
mhm,
and in a desperate situation.
mhm, mhm,
I mean, and just to say,
mhm,
things are not inexhaustible. I mean,
mhm, mhm.
I know I've marveled the idea that the ocean could run out of fish. What's that?
What do you mean? Right. How can this
Or at
happen?
least that there's a danger to that, or at least some fish, right? That
Yeah.
places can be
Yeah.
overfished, right?
Yeah.
Not given a chance. The film we saw the other night, right? The sister throwing back the little ones, say, you can't keep the little ones, right? It's gonna depopulate the lake, right? You got to give them a chance to reproduce,
Right. Right.
and that is
Sound.
sound,
It is ethical. It
rational.
is whole. It is positively rational, right? This whole notion of rational self-interest. Now
Yes,
that is an oxymoron.
yes.
That is an oxymoron, you know. So yeah, so I guess that, kind of what we're saying about the right's pushback against modernity relative to um, the rational and the secular in secular
And the
society, and
promotion of the irrational,
the promotion of the irrational, is
the
that the
deployment of the irrational.
precisely that irrational, the an irrational mass of folk are quite manageable, as you see, growing with the oft commented uh cult like quality of the quote unquote MAGA base, right? Of course, an untrustworthy media that deals little in nuance and glories in generalizations, and spectacular generalizations at that. But there is a, for instance, um, don't believe your lying eyes, believe me. There is
Mhm.
a, with this whole Doge um excursion and the um uh the takeover, the breakdown of the administrative state, that destabilizing move, and the grasp at all of this public information and whatnot, and everybody's what, the base is, what are you doing? We don't understand. So they're giving them informations, right? Information. They're giving in explanation, right? Oh, there was reading, this going into these dramas of reading what has been uncovered by this efficiency campaign, the
Mhm.
misspending. Now they're right, they're projecting it. I've seen it, I'll call it advertised as Trump has the receipts and is exposing the, you know, inappropriate spending and overspending and waste of the Biden's bureaucrat, however they're couching it. It's a justification, right? So any loophole, and not loophole, any I don't mean loophole, any rationalization, any justification will be grabbed at and say, oh, yeah, see, yeah, this is all about efficiency. This isn't about, these other negative things. Look, he's making it efficient. He just pointed out um, however, $50 million worth of condoms for, or whatever,
Right.
you know. And so again, that lack of basic kind of ability to um say, okay, this is a presentation, this is a performance, nothing is really being proven here. I'm not in a position to look at any primary sources, I still don't know what this person is doing. That still is, cut off. Nothing has actually been explained to be able to just identify that, um, not the and not the least of which have any kind of historical or context to put this behavior in, or any kind of, like, those men in the street interviews that they used to love to do,
Mhm.
going back some years, asking, Joe American, so how does checks and balances work? You know, I don't know. I write a check and balance my checkbook. I don't know, dude, whatever,
Mhm.
you know, and this kind of ha ha he, you know, um, Americans don't have any idea how their government and how their, the principles that are guiding their
Right.
system and all of that. And yet, you know, um, here it is, here it is, in a very full and damaging expression.
Mhm.
So, yeah, if I can reduce you to, um, magical thinking, because it's also not lost on me that a lot of these people who are promoting, like, say, this kind of magical and anti-expert and anti-rational thinking
Mhm.
with the vaccination themselves are
Yeah,
vaccinated,
to
and
get
their families are
vaccinated, right?
vaccinated,
Vaccinate their families.
and vaccinate their families.
And you've heard me say before. I mean, and specifically thinking about Black folks, who are distrustful of the medical sector, um, and what's in these vaccines. That I'm thinking really just the opposite. That the psychological operation is to get us to distrust the vaccines.
Mhm.
Now, as I say that, and this has been happening for a while now, as this has
Mhm.
become more
Mhm.
widespread, and
Mhm.
there's a certain logic to it, that people can understand, or at least believe, and um, it's amplified by popular people. This so what's the result?
Mhm.
There's now a measles outbreak,
Mhm.
and measles has been making a comeback, right? Because of
Mhm. Mhm.
a measles outbreak in, I believe, Texas,
Hmm.
Louisiana, which is right next to Texas,
Mhm.
has just decided that vaccination for school won't be mandatory anymore.
Mhm.
So likely
Mhm.
to lose what we call herd immunity.
Mhm.
A breakout of tuberculosis in
Mhm.
Kansas City.
Hmm.
And we should expect to
Hmm.
hear more of this, because I think there
Mhm.
is a lack of memory of
Yes,
how dangerous these diseases can be, because
absolutely.
people haven't been getting them,
Absolutely.
and they should, and so there is no memory. Um,
Absolutely.
that we don't want to see polio make a comeback. Polio can make a comeback,
Why not? Right? Why
and
not?
this notion of we should just rely on our immune systems. Why do we need to tax our immune systems more, especially when we live in a post-industrial society that is where in which the environment all is often compromising our immune systems,
Yes, good question.
and we should be focused on trying to clean it up. I mean,
Yes.
there are all these questions, and we know folks, right, who are like, I'm not putting that in my body,
Yeah,
because and it becomes like a religious principle
absolutely.
for them, right? And
Yes.
they are not going to listen to
Yes.
the doctor who works on the vaccine and can explain exactly how these various elements will leave your body. They're not hearing it, right? Because they've made up their mind.
Which is, there's a principle in here, that speaks to the quality of the pro intellectual culture, the capacity to listen, the
Hmm.
capacity to listen over an extended period of time to a series of interconnected logics, it's a feat of concentration, right? And this, that there is the emotion doesn't have a patience for.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? When we're reduced to emotion driven thought, which there is thinking involved, but it's kind of a reiteration, a regurgitation, a representation of a certain set of flattened points, right?
Mm-hmm.
But anything, right? So this quality, what is the disposition, right, of 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 a pro intellectual um uh person, you know, how what is the carriage, right? So there's because there's a different cultural manifestation in this kind of time for conversation, a kind of time to raise questions, to
Yeah.
explore questions, to go, it requires this kind of slowdown that folks don't feel like, have a perception that there's time for. You got to
Yeah.
move, you got to go, you got to get, there's that kind of, this kind of misplaced urgency, you know,
Mm-hmm.
for, in a realm where, where there's an imagined place. It's often talked about, right? Well, in beauty and barber salons, right? Because people are sitting around for an extended period of time, chopping it up. I don't know what the quality of those conversations are these days. You know what I'm saying? Because I think that also it comes from a whole different attitude. But that is also part of anti-intellectualism. It's an anti-patience
Mm-hmm.
with logics and representation. There's something
Mm-hmm.
that I wanted to read when you were talking about memory and the problem of memory. And we talk about the problem of a curtailed memory in the Black community, in terms of curtailed memory of what it meant to live in uh, uh, live in Jim Crow reality, in
Go
Black
ahead
Coat
and read it.
reality, huh?
Go ahead and read it.
Oh no, actually, so that's something that people talk about a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so this piece that I wanted to read with a quote from Susan Jacoby, who I was telling you I was looking at earlier day, an interview with her, who is a renowned commentator on the anti-intellectual culture in America. And one of the things that she says, let me find this a quote in this from this interview, is that memory has been the greatest civic casualty of the past 50 years. We can stretch it back longer than that, but she has a reason for her 50-year designation. But just the idea of memory as a
Actually, I think 50
civic,
years is kind of right on the point also.
okay, well, just saying, just making this statement, and maybe you want
Mhm.
to build on that, but just in terms of making that statement, um, talking about memory as a civic casualty, right?
Mhm.
And so where there's no, the communal memory being an aspect of critical awareness and whatnot. So go ahead and please explain why 50 is right on
Well, it
point.
just sounds about right to me, right? That um, that at least as a period when institutions, and particularly these right wing institutions, were trying to you know uh, resist the emerging narratives, right? The counter narratives, the Black studies narratives, the Native American studies narratives and discourses, um, and that people are still people still have a living memory of
Hmm.
the pre-civil rights period in that moment,
Mhm.
The period of
Mm.
uprisings and resistance and movements. People still know about the welfare rights movement, right, in 1975, right, 1973. But it's also the time that the right wing is beginning to plan the attack on that memory through an
Mhm.
attack on these educational institutions,
Mhm.
through efforts, the
Mm.
always efforts to discredit the scholarship of ethnic
Mhm.
studies scholars, uh,
Mhm.
etc. And I guess even, um, what a certainly efforts to shrink arts funding and more carefully curate, what can be um, produced, performed, etc. So that's why I think that there's a clearer memory pre 75. You said a little more than 50 years. I say yeah, 72, 73, because 50 years ago is now 75, right? I'm like, dang, right?
Right.
Suddenly, so
Right.
yeah, early 70s, people are still remembering though. I mean, even it, the 80s in particular, right, is when
Mhm.
we start deliberately moved into um, the United States of Amnesia. I think
Mm.
someone wrote the book or the
Mm.
article, right?
Mm.
But again, this very careful disappearing of aspects of history, relationships, historical relationships, not wanting to be reminded of that, calling the the anti-racist or the
Mhm.
racist for daring
Mhm.
to bring it up. And
Mhm.
but it is getting late,
Yes, it is getting late. The
and we
another thing
will
that she said,
continue. Yeah,
yes, we
go
will.
ahead.
Yeah, put this in because another thing that another comment she made about this, the relevance of memory was that she said, but if you don't have a memory that a reliable memory 5 years in the past, you can't participate in a nuanced discussion about policy decisions that your government has made, you
Mhm.
know. And so she, and really talks about this whole problem of attention span, you know,
Yeah.
um, and how that relates and where is that where is that can that memory be contained? Well, in what you seek, certainly a video, there's a video access if it is chosen and sought after. And then there is that, literature access
Excuse me.
and a practice of a kind of proactive engagement and sustained concentration. But
Mhm.
yes, 838.
And the shrinking of journalistic outlets is part of the loss of that memory. Also, the consolidating of media ownership, um,
Hmm.
and that limits the stories, right? And of
Mhm.
course, journalism has been described as uh, history in the moment, memory in the moment, right? A recording of memory in the moment. Um,
Hmm.
and they'll certainly go together, right? The shrinking of the arts, the attack on education, every aspect of education, the and particularly secular education focus, and a generalized, public education, um, and but journalism, the arts, and education, right?
Hmm.
And also, I appreciated an article I read some years ago about, there's a reason that both lawyers and teachers, and really lawyers, teachers, and reporters, are constantly, um, under rhetorical attack, or being somehow
Mhm.
diminished, right, in the public's um, mind, because it is reporters, lawyers, and teachers that are often the front line, um,
Mm.
in preparing citizens, right, to confront power, and therefore, have to be somehow, sidelined. But I'd like to finish with a quick reading also,
Mm-hmm.
and not really off topic, but I think a statement of what the right wing is doing. Maybe you've heard about this already. This was a statement from the former NFL punter for the Minnesota Vikings, Chris Cluey, who spoke at the Huntington Beach City Council, and then was removed by police as he was preparing an act of civil disobedience that he declared. I will now, participate in the long American tradition of peaceful civil disobedience.
Hmm.
Apparently, the Huntington Beach City Council voted to put a MAGA plaque on the public library. MAGA meaning something, standing for something other than Make America Great Again, but really it's a wink, wink, right? MAGA. And this was unpopular with the citizens of Huntington Beach, which is in Orange County and is primarily a Republican town. But this
Mm-hmm.
was not deemed appropriate by the citizens for Huntington Beach, but the city council voted to do it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So Chris Cluey, retired NFL player and probably forced into retirement because of his support for same-sex marriage rights,
Hmm.
and I would dare say solidarity with those who would choose to kneel for
Mm-hmm.
the national anthem. So this was Chris Cluey, either early today or yesterday at the Huntington Beach um, City Council meeting. Quote, MAGA stands for trying to erase trans people from existence. MAGA stands for resegregation and racism. MAGA stands for censorship and book bans. MAGA stands for firing air traffic controllers while planes are crashing. MAGA stands for firing the people overseeing our nuclear arsenal.
Hmm.
MAGA stands for firing military veterans and those serving them at the VA, including canceling research on veteran suicide. MAGA stands for cutting funds to education, including for disabled children. MAGA is profoundly corrupt, unmistakably anti democracy, and most importantly, MAGA is explicitly a Nazi movement. You may have replaced a swastika with a red hat, but that is what it is.
Hmm.
And it was after that he made a statement. I will now, participate in, the American tradition of nonviolent, civil disobedience. And before he made like one move away from the mic, and the police were on him,
Hmm.
had him down, carried him out. But so, props to Chris Cluey.
Right on.
That statement and that video has gone viral.
Right on.
Many people have thanked him, for saying that, making that stand, using his moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just thought, that it was good to end on a point of resistance to what the right wing and their centrist partners, or enablers maybe is better, are doing in this country 1 month into the second Trump presidency. So that's all. That's all I wanted to end on, and we will pick it
That's
back up
great.
next week because there's some things we got more to say about this, and I'm actually interested in sort of some of the cultural expression of this and this fascination, right, with an ancient world or a medieval world and monarchies and a return of some kind of aristocracy,
Mhm.
um, and this anti-democratic
Mhm.
moment that
Mhm.
is not nearly as popular
Mhm.
as is being sometimes, presented.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and that again is a global fact. And
Mhm.
indeed, in other parts of the world, outside of the imperial West, um, folks are moving toward a deeper idea of democracy, people's rule, and
Yeah.
sovereignty over,
Yes.
resources, like,
Yes.
and the embrace of science, right? the
Absolutely.
embrace of
Yes.
ways of knowing, right? And
Yes.
the both the traditional and the modern, just like
Yes.
religion and science, so to speak, don't
Mhm.
have to be in
Yes.
antagonism.
Yes.
Neither do progress and tradition, or modern. What is modern and tradition, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So with that, I guess we can say good night.
We can say good night.
All right, folks. Subscribe, like, and share, please. And if you're on Facebook, please do the same. Like, share with your friends. If things go according to ordinary plan, we'll be back Sunday with James.
With Brother James.
And so we'll see. That's our plan, to be back Sunday with James with a weekly roundup, and back again next Thursday to continue this discussion, and to intervene, right, in these attempts to roll back the progress that has been made, in gender relations. I don't like the phrasing race relations, because I think it hides the nature of those relations, which is racism.
Mhm.
But in the attempts to return us to an open structural racism, um, and uh, and this attack on the working class, right? As we're getting ready for another massive transfer of wealth to the
Mhm.
top 1% that has
Mhm.
already been the beneficiaries of 30 years of
Years.
massive transfer of wealth to the upper, 1%, and desperation for the rest of us. So we're going to pick it back up, because, again, that's what's at play here. It's about power,
It's about power.
about power. And keeping the little ones in their place, right? Um,
Only with our
we're
consent.
not the magnificos, right? We are the little ones. So anyway, we gonna big them up, though.
Right on, right
All
on.
right. Good night, folks. See y'all Sunday.